Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Welcome back to Dragoon Week, or sort of not. I guess this is technically the sequel. We've had so much we needed to talk about that we've sort of drug on into the following week, which is this week. But you know what? That's okay because, well, we like Mosins, and what's wrong with talking about them more? I don't see an issue here. So, since we're already here, let's go ahead and talk about our video today, which is, of course, the legendary Panshin bayonet. Now, before we get into what this bayonet is, we need a little bit of backstory here. Okay, so the backstory is obviously the Dragoon rifle. Well, up until the time of the Russian Civil War, the Dragoon was not the standard issued infantry rifle of the Russian Empire. That, of course, was the M91 long rifle. And while the M91 continued to be produced after the Russian Civil War and on into the 1920s, after the dust started to settle, the Soviet Union kind of looked around in the 1920s and realized, you know what? The Dragoon rifle has a lot of pros, especially in comparison to these longer M91 rifles that were lingering around the remnants of the ashes of the empire at the time. Well, they decided that it would make a lot of sense to basically standardize their infantry rifle on the Dragoon platform instead of the longer M91 platform. Okay, now there's obviously a lot of pros about doing things like that, especially when we talk about things like the overall length of the rifle. A Dragoon isn't as long, which is good because we know the M91's a very long rifle. We also know that it's lighter, and there's a few other nice things about it, like the barrel bands, disassembly is a little bit easier. There's just a lot of nice things about Dragoon rifles versus M91 rifles, okay? Y'all probably get that. But one of the things with this was the bayonet, because at the time, the standard issue bayonet for both the Dragoon and M91 rifles looked like this. It had a standard socket-style bayonet with this locking lever on it. See this guy right here? Okay. Now, this worked. In fact, this was actually a pretty good design, I would say, because what you would do is you'd tighten this screw, and then it would basically just secure this rascal onto the rifle, so you didn't have to worry as much about losing it. That rascal wasn't really going anywhere. Now, that's a definite pro, but one of the cons to this, especially what the Soviet Union found out, was the difficulty in actually fitting this locking ring. So they decided that, you know what, as nice as this is, this doesn't really lend itself as well to something like mass production, especially our mass production. Because remember, the Soviet Union mass production of rifles was not the same as, say, Belgium's mass production of rifles or the United States mass production of rifles. They had a little bit wider tolerances. Okay, Mosin's did. And that really could make something like this that you have to really fit well to the rifle to get it to work, or the bayonet to get it to work, kind of problematic here, right? I mean, you really have to get this fitted just right here to the bayonet socket to actually work right. So they said, you know what? Let's see if we can find some people to submit some designs to have a better design for a bayonet than this, with this locking ring. Maybe something that's a little bit easier to manufacture, something that lends itself a little bit better to manufacture. Because remember, these bayonets are important because they're sighted, the rifles are sighted with the bayonet on the rifle, so these are kind of important. You got to have a bayonet to work properly. Well, we did have some good submissions to this, and one of the submissions was a design by two guys named Kavakov and Kamaritsky, okay? Really two important guys that I don't think their names are very well known of, but you definitely are probably familiar with what they designed if you're familiar with Mosins at all, okay? So Kavakov and Kamaritsky designed this. What we know today is the Mosin Nagant 9130 bayonet. You're probably familiar with one of these rascals because these are pretty common. And they made a ton of these. They made millions of these bayonets. Okay, and how this differs from the older style bayonet is instead of this lever right here, which the front sight would have to travel through, and then you'd slide over, and then your sight base would be there, they designed a simple push button with a spring in it, and it's secured via this pin right here. So you have a captive spring in here, held captive by this cross pin, and of course it also helps hold this guy captive as well, the plunger, but it allows you this plunger to have some travel. So the way it would work is you'd slide this guy on over the rifle and push the plunger on, and now you can slide this over the front sight base. So now the front sight base is there, and then the plunger comes back out, locking the front sight base against this surface, so now the bayonet can't twist off of it, okay? Now, eventually, of course, this would sort of become a problem in World War II, and this would ultimately see the Russians adopt the M44 style folding bayonet, but that's a little bit too far in the future for this video. The point here is that these two guys, Kavakov and Kamaritsky, designed this bayonet, okay? And this is what we're familiar with today. So this is really how we transitioned from the Dragoon / M91 style bayonet to this guy. Except for the fact that history is a little more complicated than just this. And in fact, we have to introduce a third guy into this picture, okay? So this bayonet was designed by Kavakov and Kamaritsky, a joint design, but another guy, a third guy, came along by the name of Panshin. Now, Panshin looked at this bayonet and said, you know what, this is a great design, but there's one problem here. And that problem is that, as nice as this is, Mosin still don't have a front sight hood. Now, at this time, you can look around historically at some other countries, and you know, we would ultimately see many countries adopt rifles with hooded front sights. And one of the nice things about that is, well, it gives you protection from the front sight. Up until now, remember, with all these Dragoons and M91 rifles with this style rear sight and bayonet, they just had a little barleycorn front sight, okay? And, you know, if that thing that's got no protection, so they could get knocked around, the sight could theoretically get pushed over in one direction or the other, affecting your windage, which is bad. And of course, that's going to impact where you're going to shoot, but also it could just get damaged, right? You could get a big chunk knocked out of it if it gets hit on a rock or another rifle or something. All sorts of potential issues for having an unprotected front sight. So Panshin came along and said, you know what, the Mosin could really benefit from a hooded front sight. Now, there's really two ways you can do this to provide a protection or a hood for a front sight. One is to just redesign the front sight entirely. But the other way to do this, and this is really only viable if your bayonet is always affixed to the rifle when you're shooting, but that's true for Mosin. So instead, of course, this is the Soviet way, the perhaps less logical way to many people. We're going to put the front sight protector on the bayonet itself. Thus, we have the Panshin bayonet. So really what this bayonet is taking the Kavakov-Kamaritsky design, but applying a front sight hood to it. So this really is, a lot of people call these the Panshins. Technically, this would be the Kavakov-Kamaritsky Panshin, but that's a kind of a long name, so I guess we could just call it the Panshin. But remember, Panshin didn't design really any of this bit. He just designed this bit. This whole extra bit was somebody else. But now at least we have our bayonet today, and we can look at what exactly this rascal is. So we can compare this here. This is really the same thing, the way these bayonets affix, but we can see right here on this sort of exposed ring right here, there's a hooded front sight attached to it. Now, if you were going to just mill out this whole one piece, this would be really hard to do. So they were smart about this, and the way the factories built these was the hood is a separate piece. But how is it a separate piece? Well, if you look here, you can see it's actually dovetailed on to the bayonet. Okay, so instead of just being rounded here on the bayonet socket body, they actually cut these slots so you can dovetail the front hood on, and not just that, there's a little screw here that fully secures it to the bayonet body. So that's a good design because it's pretty simple to produce, and of course it's now going to provide protection to our front sight. Really handy. So how many of these were produced? Well, I unfortunately don't have really good estimates on that at this time. It definitely was not in the millions or probably even, huge hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands. It's definitely in the thousands, though, as far as we can tell. And I don't think it's out of the realm to say at least tens of thousands. These are definitely not prototype bayonets, as some people might say. Now, why do I say it wasn't a prototype bayonet? Well, you can see here this is definitely has a original serial number, and we can tell from this serial number that this matches the font of the Tula factory from around the 1930s, and that makes sense because we could see our Tula stars here and here. So this bayonet was actually produced by the Tula factory. This is what we would consider a mass-produced bayonet. But they didn't make these for very long. Okay, now why is that? Well, this is where it gets interesting because as far as I can tell, when both of these were adopted right around the time of around 1930, let's say, as far as I can tell, they were actually producing both of these bayonets at the same time. One of the things with the Soviet Union is if you really want to test something out, you have to produce quite a lot of them, okay? And one of the ways we would see this was in, of course, 1943, when the Soviet Union produced approximately 50,000 M44 carbines with a folding bayonet as sort of wartime prototypes. But I mean, 50,000, that's sort of a large manufacturing quantity to be a prototype. But again, this is the Soviet Union. The way they like to do things sometimes was just produce a quite sizable amount. I mean, to the Soviets, though, a quite sizable amount might be, a million things, right? Because they're producing just vastly huge quantities of things, especially during wartime. Not so much in the 30s, but still producing quite a lot of things, in at least the hundreds of thousands. 50,000 in comparison to like a million or 2 million is not that much. But what that does still provide you with is a large enough sample size to really get a good understanding of is it going to work well or not. So I had at least seen one historical picture of a soldier using a Panshin bayonet, but you don't really see these too often. So certainly a large quantity of these were lost during Operation Barbarossa in 1941 where the Nazis invaded. And there's another big problem here, because ultimately we would see in the mid-1930s the full adoption of the hooded front sight, okay? So this is where things get interesting, because we started out having a hood on our bayonet. But as we know today, if you look at any normal 9130 rifle, it's going to have a hooded front sight. So they realized that, as nice as this is, we're just going to switch to making the standard Kavakov-Kamaritsky bayonet, and we're going to have a hooded front sight instead of this. So ultimately, as nice as the Panshin design was, it would go away in favor of a new front sight. Okay, now here's the problem. Okay, now if you start producing a bunch of rifles now with that hooded front sight, you can try to put this on, but that dog ain't gonna hunt because the hooded front sight is gonna hit this rascal, and you're gonna have a bad time trying to get one of these on. So, as you can already tell, there's a big problem with backwards compatibility on these guys. And of course, if we look at in World War II, when the Soviets are producing millions and millions of new 9130 rifles, these bayonets aren't going to work on those. So very quickly, you would probably see somebody saying, you know what, this is not very helpful. So how do you remedy that? Well, let's say you had some of these lying around for whatever reason, and you needed to get a 91 to put them on a 9130 rifle. You probably could. What you'd have to do is remove that screw there. And thankfully there's this cutout here so you can actually reach it from the top, but you'd have to pull out that screw, knock the front sight off, so maybe at least you could still use this on a 9130 rifle. I don't know how often that was done, but it is one possibility that kind of lends itself to be rather interesting. So definitely keep that in mind, that some of these maybe were then just removed to work on 9130 rifles, but certainly a lot of these bayonets were probably just ended up getting discarded or were simply lost to attrition, because these are only made for probably a few years, around 1930 as far as we can tell. So these definitely are not common, and you rarely see them today. These bayonets are rare, but they do exist, okay? And generally when you find them, they're actually in rather pretty decent condition. I mean, this one's actually quite nice. It just has the original Tula serial number on it. That's pretty cool. Now, both the Tula factory and Izhev's factory would produce these, again, lending itself to the fact that this is not just some weird prototype design. This actually is sort of a production/production trials bayonet, but it was certainly made in adequate scale. They didn't make just like a few hundred or a few thousand of these as far as we can tell. It was probably more than that, because you had two different factories making these. Pretty cool. So you can find them marked with the Tula star as well as the Izhevsk triangle with the arrow in it that we see. Also kind of helping us understand that the ones that I've seen at least were made during or after 1928 because of these later factory markings. But around 1930 is probably when these were made, give or take a year or two. But not too much after that, because again, they probably didn't make these for very long. But ultimately, again, that hooded front sight was adopted, rendering this bayonet sort of to the ash heap of history. Although, thankfully, some of these are still around. These bayonets are not super cheap, unfortunately, and they have gotten a lot more expensive. So if you can find one of these, I do recommend picking one up if it's not like a horrible price. Generally, these can cost as much or even potentially who you're looking at more than a 9130 rifle itself, just for the bayonet. But it is worth it because it's just a really fascinating piece of history, and it's just sort of lost to the sands of time, and not a lot of people know about these. So it's always good to invest something that not a lot of people know about, because as more and more people become interested in these types of things, the demand for them is going to tend to rise, and well, I could see the value going up, because a lot of these, again, that you find are in pretty nice condition, which does lends itself pretty well to being collectible, like this one that's complete. So definitely recommend checking one of these out if you're able to find one, and that would be awesome if you're able to pick one up. Again, what's cool about bayonets is there's a lot more bayonet collectors than there are Mosin collectors, potentially, okay? Now, I don't have a good number on how many Mosin collectors are, but generally speaking, there's a ton of bayonet collectors out there, because these things tend to not be heavily regulated like guns are. So, you know, maybe you can't necessarily easily own a Mosin where you live, although it's probably possible in at least many, many countries. So definitely check out the rules on where you live. But even if you're interested in just like starting out with bayonets, this is a great place to start out, because these are really easily attainable no matter what country you probably live in. These are internationally traded. So if you're in Estonia, you could probably buy this from Big Sam, or vice versa, or all sorts of different countries on Earth. So that's another reason that bayonets tend to be kind of expensive, the more collectible ones, because there's just a big market for it, right? It's like coins. I mean, they're just not regulated like firearms are. So really interesting stuff. All right, well, I hope y'all enjoyed taking a closer look at this Panshin bayonet. We don't get to see these very often, so I'm glad we were able to bring one to you today. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.